Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Aristotle's Politics. Today we're dealing with Chapter 11 of Book 4. Now, Chapter 11 of Book 4 follows what we consider the giving examples of the different varieties of regimes, right? We talked about, I kind of spent a lot about summarizing in the last chapter of where we got here, how we got there. And chapter 10 ends with the account of tyranny, which then ends the variations of the different how to type, each regime type and their variations, right? And I explained that. Now we are expected to talk about the establishment of the regime. Now, of course, he's kind of hinted at that earlier, right? The polity. We said, what is therefore we're gonna look at the question here. What he says here, he says, what regime is best and what way of life is best for most cities and for most human beings, judging with a view to neither virtue of the sort that is beyond private persons nor to education, in respect to those things requiring special advantages provided by nature, equipment, and an equipment depending on chance, nor to the regime that would pray for, but a way of life which it is possible for most to share in, and a regime of which most cities can partake. So this is not. He said what? He says what regime is the best, and which way of life is best for most cities and most human beings. Now he says, judging this, neither in a view to what is beyond private persons. So therefore, in other words, it's not something that is beyond the average person to do it. Private persons themselves. This is, in other words, private people. The everyday person out there should be able to do this. Right? Nor to education. In other words, something that only a special type of education will do it. And he goes, right, in respect to those things requiring advantages of nature and equipment dependent on chance, nor to the regime one would pray for. So, in other words, we're not going to be dealing with something that we have to get something that either we need to create a regime that is particular by education or by nature. That, in other words, advantages, certain natural advantages that nature has, or that's on equipment depending on chance. In other words, this is the regime that is not dependent on chance. What is going to be? In other words, we don't have to get lucky. In other words, it's a regime that, without these extraordinary things, we can produce. We don't have to pray for it. Please. In other words, it's not something that is going to be by. We have to get lucky on. It doesn't require special things of nature and things and material things that we get by chance. What is the most likely thing that's going to happen? Most of these, what is going to happen is the most likely and the most most likely best outcome. Right? This is this, and he says, but a way of life which it is possible for most to share in, and a regime in which most cities can partake. This is what is best in that sense, right? For those that are, therefore, this idea that what is the best practical regime? This is that famous line. We get the discussion of what is the best practical regime. For those that are called aristocracies, the ones we were just speaking of, either fall outside the range of most cities or border on so-called regime, politeia, the so-called regime. Hence, we may speak of both as one. So he says, okay, everything we discussed earlier about those two things, there's supposed to be two. Remember, that's the weird thing. Remember, he kept on blurring them. That's really one. The regime polity, so-called regime called regime, and so-called aristocracy, that's really the same thing. So what was two really becomes one. So therefore, and the confusion of that thing about that always bringing the two reinforces this point. That's really one. It's all about blending. And as I mentioned in my chapter about chapter 9, 2 videos ago, about this, I think I'm right here that there's really two principal regimes: the rule of the many and the rule of the few, the rule of the people, the rule of the multitude, or the rule of the notables, right? Oligarchy. These are the real, and then there's blending. But the nature of the city is blending. Regime. The city is a component of parts. The regime is a component of parts. The regime is the ordering of those parts. Which one is the ruling part? Okay, the ordering, the taxis. This is the taxis. The ordering. A regime orders the parts. It gives the form, the eidos. So it's a taxis. Taxis emerged from the eidos, the form. The order emerges from form. So we notice that this best regime is going to always be the regime that's most common. Therefore, what is going to be common? Some mixture. Not the extreme, because remember, the democracy at its most pure or most extreme point, and oligarchy is most extreme point, are the worst on both. Right? And therefore, since the city is an aggregate part, therefore we can't escape from the different parts, and therefore it's a balancing of the parts. This goes right back to the beginning of one, that preserving the regime. The nature of all political life, political rule, it's easy to create something. It's more difficult to perpetuate it. And what is perpetuating it? It's stabilizing it. It's balancing it. We balance a mixture. It's like the balls in the air. So let's return. Judgment in all these matters rests on the same element. Judgment in all these matters rests on the same element. If it was correctly said, as we said in the Ethics, this is that famous line 43. This is that line here, Nicholas Ethics 11:01 A14 to A16. That's that famous line about the mean, I think, right? That the happy life is one accordance with virtue and unimpeded, and that is virtue as unimpeded. In other words, between two extremes, right? This extreme, and that virtue is a mean. But then, wait a minute. This is where he kind of blurs it. Meaning, he says, then a middling sort of life is best. Whoa! Stop. The mean that is capable of being attained is each sort of individual for each sort of individual. This is not what he says here. Yes, virtue is virtue is according to the happy life in accordance with virtue that is unimpeded. Not, and yes, it's a mean between two extremes. And the extreme is what? An extreme of deficiency and the extreme of excess. Virtue is still it is not a average in that sense. It is a right, it is a peak. It is a peak between two extremes. It is the correct action. A mean is not to be understood as an average. It is not an average of these two things. It is rather that which avoids these two excess and it avoids deficiency of the action. It's a kind of action. Every virtue is a specific kind of action towards a specific type of activity. Let's think of the virtues. What is arete excellence? Is means doing excellence. Virtue means to do something correctly. It is the doing beautifully, the doing finely, the doing nobly. It's being kalos and it's doing right. It's true. It's true and it is done beautifully. Kalos. Okay. It is done finely. So therefore, what is the activity in question? It's an activity. What is it? So what is the activity in question? How do we do fear? Right, fear. My response to fear. I can either ignore fear. This is the extreme of deny fear. What is fear? Fear is the realization that something's dangerous. Right. So I ignore fear. I'm the berserker that goes out there mad. That's an extreme. That's not virtue. That's an extreme. By ignoring the reality of the situation is not a virtue. Succumbing to fear is not the virtue. The virtue, courage, is what? It's not the absence of fear. It is mastering it so that you are able to act. Right? It is not the abandoning of fear. No, no, it's not being without fear. It is looking, taking the fear you have with the consequence. The fear is rational. The question is what you do. Do you simply succumb to it and refuse to act? Or do you act? That courage is being able to do what you need to do in the face of fear. That is understand what the virtue is. It's not a average. Same thing with sosphosune, sound-mindedness, moderation, right? It's what about pleasures. It's it's not saying deny pleasures. It is what? It is knowing when you go too far, not going too far. Not to deny pleasures, that's the extreme, and then engaging completely in pleasure without taking consequences into consideration. That's the two extremes. Denying it, saying no pleasure at all. That's one extreme, the deficiency. And the excess is just imbibing it, right? So therefore, this is, we have to understand that the accountant virtue and the ethics is not an average. It is a peak between an excess or a deficiency, radical deficiency, in regarding to a specific act. Here he says, now this is the trick. Now he's thinking, wait a minute, he's waiting for the student to raise their hand and say, Mr. Aristotle, why are you, what is this? Because he's playing the trick here, that it's the middling sort. The middling sort. There is a point here. The point is not that he needs to talk about the middling sort, because he's raised this issue earlier about the problem of the wealthy and the poor. Those poor, those without, remember the word poor is a prior, means prior means resources, without the resources, or means, a prior is means. How do you deal with things? How to deal with the resources or necessity of things? And most translations of prior, Xenophon writes a book, Prior, which is about, it's often translated ways and means. This is his economic, this is a book about economic policy in Athens, his recommended economic policy for Athens. Famous, it's a very good ways and means. It's about resources, prior, what is it? How to deal, what are the resources we need in order to live? And in order to live well, right? First, we need to live. First, we need to survive. The ways of life deal with the times of how do we get resources? How do we live? How do we sustain ourselves? How do we, we sustain ourselves by our food and our resource, and our, these things, right? Sustenance, sustenance, right? To live well, and that we first must sustain ourselves, and then we are able to escape the needs of necessity, and then we're in the realm of choice, and therefore we can choose what is best. He goes, these same defining principles must also define virtue in vice, and in the case of the city and a regime. Think of this. Now he says the middle, that's a trick. But he's saying something here about this. But virtue defining principles must also define virtue and vice in a way in the case of the city. For the regime is the way of life of the city. Okay, so the regime deals with the way of life of the city. So which regime is best tied to the way of life? Now, in all cities, there are three parts of the city. Whoa! We go back and go read chapter 3. He's reducing it. Oh, there's two originally, right? The two parts that become then many parts. The two twos, remember, the rich and the poor, the many and the few. Then what happens is that we get the in book 4, chapter 4, we get those many parts of the city, right? And that the member of the multitude and the notables, there are multiple types of multitudes. There's not one multitude. There's different multitudes based on the type of the life of the choose they choose. Same thing with the notables. Kind of their way of life varies. So not only is there a way of life of the many and the few, but then there's also the way of life of each group of them that differentiates. Right? This is why the regimes are more than two in that sense, right? But then he says three parts: the very well off, ubulia, uprior, wealthy, right? The very well off, and the very poor, the a prior. See, this is the word. The wealthy is well prior. The poor are alpha privative prior. A prior. Without means. They are without resources, without means. They only have their bodies. Where the wealthy have resources, lots, plenty, well. And the third, those in the middle between these. In other words, they're not wealthy, but they have enough. Remember, go back to the beginning of the nature of the city. This what defines the city as a city, the koinonia as a city. It is that perfection of the koinonia, right? The city is that perfected koinonia, which is what it's that which has enough. It's able to sustain itself. Therefore, the mesos here is that group who have enough. They're like the city. They have enough. They're able to sustain themselves, self-sufficient. They're not poor, but they're not wealthy. Why is this important? Well, let's look at this. He says, since, however, it is agreed that what is moderate and middling is bad, that's a trick. Because we said that he brings the aristocracy. He brings Aristotle brings the discussion of the ethics here, but he misrepresents it. He misrepresents the discussion very Machiavellianly, misrepresents it by saying the middle is best. We've seen the virtue is the mean, and therefore the middle is. There's a trick here. It's a nice 3-card Monte trick. Aristotle's doing something here. He wants us to realize he wants to use the authority of the ethics and the argument of the mean to argue for the middling is best. But the argument of the ethics is not the middling is best. The best is an extreme. Best is that right thing to do. It is the correct action. Here he's saying that no, it's because it's a blended thing. It's more complicated. It's not pure action. Because since it's agreed that what is moderate, sophosune, and middling is best, it is evident that in the case of goods of fortune as well, a middling possession is the best of all. Of wealth, of fortune, of wealth. The middling is best of all. He's using the authority of virtue to make an argument about the authority of possessions. But let's pay attention. I think that he's the argument is his argument here is kind of a bad argument. He knows it, but his argument is not that it's based on virtue. He's trying to make it an argument of virtue, but he's really talking about habit, which is really more about the habits of people, which is a second virtue. This is habit is not virtue per se. It is kind of the actions. It's a kind of second virtue, a second nature, right? It is not a nature that is inherent. It's a nature that we create. It's our choices, our actions, our inheritance, what we've been taught. It's what we're used to doing, and it becomes a kind of a law for us, a norm for us, right? For it is readiest to obey reason. For it is readiest, in other words, the middling sort, the middling possession it is readiest to obey reason. For the one who is overly handsome, overly strong, overly well born, overly wealthy, or the reverse of these things, overly indigent, overly weak, or overly lacking honor, it is difficult to follow reason. The moderate is able to follow. The middling sort is more listen. His argument is the middling is more open to reason. Why? Because if you're overly handsome, overly strong, overly well born, and overly wealthy, or the opposite, you are well, this is what would be overly, who's not handsome, but overly indignant, means ugly. I don't know. Overly weak, overly lacking in honor. In other words, what's four, handsome, strong, and overly, in other words, 4 and 3. He's silent about the ugly. Overly strong and overly indigent, that means weak, overly well born, bad things, and then overly wealthy, poor, right? Indigent. So the last wealthy is indignant, poor, right? The next well born is tied to the third. Strong is weak, and handsome is absent. The first is there's no response to the first, the ugly. Notice that. That these 4 excesses and the 3 negative excesses are unlikely to be able to listen to reason. The ugly may be able to listen to reason, but beautiful aren't. That's interesting, right? The beautiful just can't be listening to reason. The handsome is just simply handsome. This is what handsome does, right? The beautiful ones don't listen to reason. He seems to be saying, but the ugly do. He doesn't make the claim that the ugly is likewise adherent to reasons. Those of us who are ugly are closer to reason than the beautiful. Maybe that's a pun, right? Aristotle's making a pun here. The former sort tends to become arrogant. So the overly handsome, overly strong, overly well born, overly wealthy, these become arrogant. And base, arrogant and base. Base means bad, low, on a grand scale. The latter, which are what? The indigent, the poor, right, without nothing. Indigent means those without anything. The overly weak and those who are and those who lack honor become the latter malicious and base in petty ways. So the first are arrogant and base on grand levels. The latter malicious and base in petty ways. And acts of injustice are committed either through arrogance or through malice. So injustice happens because of arrogance or malice. Remember that. Justice happens through arrogance or malice. Moreover, these are least inclined either to avoid ruling or to be wish to be ruled, both of which things are injurious to cities. Now, here, 44, the text is meaning uncertain. He accepts Bernays' conjectural avoid ruling and the parakoso porekai of the manuscript, but the verbs perekai and bolinece in the sense to wish to rule are found nowhere else. The entire clause may be corrupt or out of place. It is bracketed by Dranzer's, the German edition, in the gloss. Perhaps it is perhaps possible to take it to mean that both rich and poor, and not the middle class, the apparent antecedent of these, shun public service as cavalry commanders, polikokos, or heads of consuls, bakalos. But this is not very satisfactory in the immediate context. So this is that weird. This is what he's doing here for that to understand here. In other words, they avoid ruling or wish to hold. In other words, these wealthy people don't want to do certain obligations. The very rich don't want to do things. They want to enjoy their wealth. They don't want to sacrifice anything for the sake of the city. It's like today's a wealthy today. The wealthy today won't join the army. They won't send their children to join the wealth. The very wealthy won't want to send their children to serve. They don't want to sacrifice anything. They want to enjoy their wealth, and they deserve. You say this, right? This is the danger of the very wealthy. The very wealthy are arrogant. They demand to be. They don't want to be ruled. They don't want to take orders. And the other ones who are weak, they're envious of those other people. The ones who have nothing, they look at that with envy and resentment, and they're again, that's the opposite problem, right? Won't those who cannot rule, unwilling to rule because they're afraid or lack the ability, or the other one is they could rule but they won't bother because it interferes with their pleasure and they're having a good time, right? And both of these things are injurious to cities. In addition, those who are preeminent in the goods of fortune, strength, the goods of fortune, or the fortune, right? You got police answers going because the police station's nearby. Okay, in other words, preeminent in the goods of fortune, the good things of fortune, which are what? Strength, wealth, friends, and the other things of this sort. Neither wish to be ruled nor know how to be. They don't want to be ruled. If I have excess of all the fortune, I don't I don't want to follow other people's rules. And I don't know how to be either. I have to be willing to learn to obey. This is why, I mean, you want to understand why the old English private school, public schools, why did they let their, young children get buggered and brutalized in private school? Why there was hazing? The reason why those elite schools had hazing, it was a mechanism of teaching the better students how to submit. This is why the Spartans did what they did with the children, of forcing them to go sacrifice. Forcing the best to sacrifice is teaching them how to obey. You need to teach the wealthy and power to obey. If they're not taught to obey, if they're not taught the habits of obedience and service, they will simply just have their wealth and power and won't. Okay, that's the point he's trying to make here. They will neither wish to be ruled or know how to be. This is something that marks them from the time they are children at home. For the effect of living in luxury is that they do not become habituated to being ruled, even at school. But those who are excessively needy with respect to these things are too humble. So he goes from this that if you're wealthy and you're like extreme wealthy and you've never been habituated, and even at school, you're not really taught how to do this. I don't think and I think here the school point is a point he's saying. The schools of the time, schools, I think the English understood. I think the old English aristocracy knew how to deal with this, how to make the wealthy, and that's why you need separate schools for the wealthy and the poor. You can't put them together. The wealthy need to be traded. The wealthy need schools, which they're able to do it, but they're also taught to be sacrificial. And the poor need to be educated to overcome their lack. In other words, this is why I would argue the liberal arts should be taught. In other words, teaching everyone this is Tocqueville's point about liberal arts. Tocqueville says that we can't have teaching liberal arts to everyone. The poor don't need liberal arts. The poor needs to have skills they know to survive, technical training, education, the skills. In other words, they need the necessary skills to learn to be able to enter into the economy and to avoid their poverty. But don't we making this is what why Du Bois, this is the famous debate between Du Bois, W.B. Du Bois, and oh come on, I know his name, the self not for Frederick Douglass, but the other African American. Come on, Booker T. Washington. The Booker T. Washington Du Bois debate. Du Bois said, no, all black people need to. W.T. Washington argued that black people need, ex-slaves need to learn skills, need the mechanic job, need to do this. Only as they grow in the economy, then they can this. Then this. What Du Bois said, no, we must have the arts and these things immediately given to them. See, this is the difference. See, the thing about this is the argument here is that, but okay, you follow Du Bois, then what's going to happen is that they will never learn, get the habits of, except they'll just stay in their condition of being slaves. That's this trick. In other words, the wisdom of Washington's argument was that the slaves needed to learn how the habits of mastery, not mastery, self mastery, and that therefore they do this by what? Getting the skills necessary to make them productive. Because they lacked, they didn't know how to do this. They needed to learn the skills. They needed a form of improvement, and that to teach them the knowledge, to say that they should have the same education as those who are already self-ruling, who have enough. The better they are what of the wealthy and the best. They're at that peak. No. That's the problem. You can't. That's a recipe in failure. Aristotle will be saying here. This will only produce mass, because then what happened is they won't achieve it, and therefore you're going to have to. Well, we can't have this because you put people who are not qualified or able to do something in a position where they will only fail. Will they feel better? No, they'll feel worse. In fact, then what you have to do is you have to help them pass, so they don't. You can't make them feel so horrible like that. So therefore, you kind of change it and help them out a little bit. But then what happens? Everyone else rules. It debates because the people who, once you start doing this, for one group, others who are not in that group are also going to the idea of we treat merit as merit. Okay, never merit is an aristocratic concept. If you want equality should be lottery. If you want to have equality in the elite schools, you should have lotteries. This big giant lottery. Who gets to go to what school? That would produce chaos. But that'd be fair, be democratic and equal. But merit actually produces an aristocratic. That's why we had this thing. Once the left demanded merit in the universities, when that made aristocratic systems in the higher education more aristocratic. That's why there's more inequality in America at the elites, because now there's a big gulf between the poor going to an elite school and not going to elite school. In the bad old days, there was not much different going to Harvard and going to a state university. Yeah, okay, you were in the right class. You were part of the ruling class, but you weren't significantly better than them. Harvard graduates were good, but not superstars. Now, because you're only accepting the best, now Harvard means that you are the best of the best. So therefore, every even some loser, moronic loser who fails to graduate, like Zuckerberg or think about that. Zuckerberg, by just getting into Harvard, was able to attract development money. He had a good idea. So didn't what's the other guy? Gates. Both of these guys, they might have been good con men and good organizers of things, and that's knew something about some things and able to use their knowledge. But were they? If they didn't go to Harvard, would anyone pay attention to them? And why? Because they went to Harvard, they were. Did they graduate Harvard? No. Right? Remember that. Failing, getting into Harvard is more important. Is more significantly important than it's harder to get into Harvard than to graduate Harvard. That shouldn't be the case, but it is. This is the point Aristotle is kind of making here. Let's continue because we're going over this. This is something that marks them from the time they're children at home and they're living in luxury. Is that they do not become habituated to being ruled even at school. But those who are excessively weak, excessively needy in this respect to these things, are too humble. So the ones who do not know how to rule, but own, so the ones do not. Okay, so the ones do not know how to rule, but only how to be ruled. That's the weak, the latter sort, right? Those and then only to be ruled like a slave. And the others do not know how to be ruled by any sort of rule, but only to rule like a master, a despote. So the weak don't know how to they don't know how to become rulers, but they only obey and they behave. Therefore, they're ruled like a slave. They only know how to be ruled like a slave. They don't know how to they're not able to rule, and because they're not able to rule, to rule, they only obey, and therefore when they only can obey, then they act like they're ruled like a slave. And the master knows only how the wealthy and these other type only know how to command. They are ruled like a master. They don't know how to be ruled. They don't know how to be ruled. They refuse to be ruled, and they rule others like masters. The one is consumed by envy, the other contempt. So the poor envy, the rich, the wealthy contempt. Nothing is further removed from affection from a political community. Love, affection. In other words, if your envy and contempt are the enemies of affection, a political community requires that the parts have affection towards each other. A koinonia, a community, a political entity that is able to, if I don't like you, if I have no affection to you, then this is not, you're not, what? Why should we don't, I'm not going to be, you're not part of me. You're my enemy. If I have no love of you and you're someone else, you're a stranger who is getting things that I should get. See the problem here? Contempt and envy undermine affection. And the city is held together as much by affection for each other, love of each other, as it is by interest. The common good is as much about mutual affection and friendship as it is mutual benefit. Libertarians, take note. This is what I always get angry with libertarians. And the liberal argument, the neoliberal argument is everything is going to be mutual benefit, mutual benefit. No, no, no. You need to, yes, mutual benefit can cause affection, but affection must happen. And if you have contempt for people, there's no affection. If there's envy, there's not going to be affection. Maybe through luck and mutual shared life together, you can make affection. That's why maybe this is why the discussion of friendship in book the ethics is very important to understand. And this is part of the politics in that sense. This is why the ethics the friendship is necessary in the ethics. And it's actually very important for the politics. Now let's continue. They only know they only rule like masters. What comes into being then is a city not of free persons, but of slaves and masters. The one consumed by envy and the other by contempt. So it's not, remember, there's no city of slaves and no city of masters. What you've done by a city, by the rich and the poor, there's only the rich and the poor. There's the very wealthy and the very poor. This is a city of slaves. There's a city of masters and a city of slaves with nothing in common. There's not one city, but two. And actually, isn't that the argument that he makes in about the danger of the republic? Back in book 2, isn't that his criticism of the so-called aristocratic regime, the so-called best regime of Sparta? Also, the same critique he makes of Plato's account of the best regime. There's not one city, but two. One consumed of envy and one consumed of contempt. Nothing is further removed from affection from a political community. And the community involves an element of affection. Enemies do not wish to have even a journey in common. In other words, you cannot have a koinonia of enemies. You won't even have a journey together. You won't trust them. No trust. No trust. Friendship builds trust. Trust builds koinonia, community. Sharing a common thing. Sorry, it's frustrating. Okay, now I'm getting slow to say everything. The city wishes, the city wishes at any rate to be made of equal and similar persons to the extent possible. And this is most particularly the case with the middling element. If you can have a city where everyone is basically the same in the same level, not too rich and not too poor, this is the best situation. That's luck. So the art of this, the skill of this, is to build the middle, to build people who are not poor. It's not the creation of the middle class. See, this is where I think the middle class hypothesis argument is wrong. The middle class hypothesis, or the middle class, and this is the kind of modern idea. This is what I would call, what's this? Martin Seymour Lipset's so-called his famous classic 1950 article, 1950, 1969, I forget what year. It's the economic preconditions argument. The famous article on some economic preconditions of democracy argument. That unless you have a middle class, there can be no stable democracy. But for him, his middle class is an urban, industrial, educated class. Urban, industrial, educated class. The bourgeoisie. But the bourgeoisie is not. See, the problem with Mr. Seymour Lipset and his type is that they see the bourgeois in the urban class and fail to understand it's about the question of excess and defect. When the bourgeoisie was simply people with enough in building, but when the bourgeoisie becomes the wealthy, they become the problem. This is why Rousseau's critique of the bourgeoisie is not wrong. Rousseau's critique of the problem of the bourgeoisie is correct, is that when they were useful, when they were immediate, they are a mechanism by which the modern state emerges from the escaping from the aristocratic order. Okay, it's important to understand that. This is why we must understand that the rise of the bourgeoisie, the rise of this commercial class, but there's a commercial class. The burghers were the city was the commercial, the skills, the merchant people. Once they become the wealthy, they will have all the habits of the aristocrats. Aristotle's point is not that the aristocrat, it's excess of wealth, that they no longer see themselves as part of the community. They are better than. They're supermen. They're better beings. They become so different. This is subspeciation. Aristotle's talking about here really is a form of subspeciation. That what happens is that, imagine this, that all of a sudden the situation, the environment separates one species into two radically different things, that they have very nothing and more in common to each other, and to the point where they can't even interbreed with each other. That's what happens. This is what Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart points to. What do you mean? The wealth, look at the wealthy. Do they ever breed with the lower classes? They might, but likely would a a child of the wealthy class really do that? Not anymore. Look at dealing. Will they go? Think of this. Would it? Do Harvard and Yale people marry people from community college? Okay, a geeky looking guy might marry a cute girl, but one of the wealthy girls here marrying the hick boy who's not a scientist, who's not a rocket scientist, or a superstar, or because of his talent or something. He's a rock star, right? Okay, might never went to school, but he's a rock star. Yeah, maybe that, but not the kid in the corner. You understand? That is the self-selection process of differentiation. Intermarriage creates intermarriage is the essential element of holding a community together. If what happens is that they become so separate and they don't have any connection, they become separate entities. They become two cities. And they will become into conflict, partisanship, civil war will happen. So, it is most particularly the case of the middling element, right? This is this idea of stabilization. So this city must necessarily be governed in the best fashion if it is the makeup, if it is the makeup of the elements out of which we assert the city is by nature constituted. Right? We talked about this. The city is nature by constituted. And we need to be governed in the best fashion. Ubolia. This city must be necessary. This idea, moderated, so concern itself with this tension. That the city is, we assert that the city is by nature constituted. Also, if citizens in the city are most particularly preserve themselves, also of the citizens in these in cities, these most particularly preserve themselves. This middlings, this idea, these cities, for neither do they desire the things of for neither do they desire the things of the others. For as the poor do, nor the other things as or other things, their things. They do not desire. Okay, no, for they need for they for neither do they desire the things of others. Okay, that's what it is. I said that wrong. The middle class not as envious. But wait a minute, doesn't the keeping up with the Joneses leave us to envy? Can't we always? Isn't there always this escape? They want to be, and that's Veblen. Thurston Veblen. Famous argument is that conspicuous consumption, that this is the nature of capitalism and the nature of commercial society. We have to perpetuate this kind of, and he says that's the real thing that drives us is status. So therefore, status seeking. In other words, that we're not really chosen by, we are driven by status desire, because what your initial status desire between the divide in between the hunters and gatherers, men and women, leads us to a desire not to be like the latter and more like the former. So we imitate that we desire to imitate. That's Thurston Veblen's argument in his theory of leisure class, right? This is what motivates us, not just common interest, but also the interest and utility of status, right? We want to have status. We drive. Human beings seek status in that sense. So, okay, we're looking at this. What is best possible? The cities must be preserved themselves. Now, in other words, that the middling sort do not desire the things of others. They have enough. They have enough. They don't lack. As the poor do. The poor have nothing, and therefore they have nothing, and because they have nothing, they want something. And what they want, the others have it, they don't. Therefore, they want their things. As the poor desire those of the wealthy. And as a result of not being plotted against or plotting against each other, they pass their time free from danger. In other words, I don't want what they have. The middle class is not going to be. Aristotle's argument is, the people who have enough aren't really conniving to take from someplace, and they're not being plotted against by others. They're not being plotted against. They're not plotting. Therefore, they're kind of. In other words, they don't have enough that they're envied, and they're not. They have enough, so they're not envious, right? On this account, the prayer of Philoctetes was a fine one. So this is this prayer, right? This is, many things are best for the middling. I would be of the middling sort in the city. Now, 45 is an interesting thing. This is a fragment. Again, this fragment is from this collection of fragment, and we got the fragment only because of Aristotle, in a sense. So this prayer that Aristotle promotes, many things are best for the middling, and because of that, not one thing or few things, but I would be of the middling sort in a city. So I desire to be in the middle. The middle does not, it is what? It is, I have enough. I don't want. I have no need of want. But I'm also satisfied. I don't want more. The wealthy want more. The wealthy tend to always want more, right? They have a lot. They can't be ruled. I want more because of ambition, greatness. The other ones have nothing and they want. So therefore, this is that weird thing. It is clear, therefore, that the political community that depends on the middling sort is the best as well. Notice, it's not a regime. It is the reality. This is not about a particular regime. This is about stability, the nature of stabilizing any regime, to avoid the excess of defect, of lack, and excess. This echoes the Aristotelian mean, but it's not the same in this sense. Those cities are capable of being well governed, ubolia, in which the meddling element is numerous, most particularly if it is superior to both the other parts, but if not, superior to either of them. For when added to one, it will tip the scale and prevent the opposing excess from arising. So ideally, you should have a majority who has enough. Farmers, farmers, farmers. Why is the farming democracy the best democracy? We'll talk about both cases. It's the case where the multitude has enough. They may not be perfect, but they have the ability to feed themselves. This is why the The urban laboring multitude are dangerous, and the city poor, the multitude of the city, the poor of the rural. If you have two poors, rural poor or city poor, who's going to be more dangerous? City poor. Why? They don't have any means to sustain themselves, only their bodies. The rural poor will have land or live off the land. Maybe not their own land, but the land. Peasants are better than workers. Why? Both are poor, both are weak, but one is going to be fat, peasant, and the other is going to be starving, rapacious. Um, this is the story. This is oh come on, the famous Heinrich Heine, the German poet of the early Enlightenment, or not Enlightenment, late Enlightenment, Rome, 1800s. Famous poet, this is that famous one. We should worry about burning men. Heine, the Jewish writer, who's very German, but it's Heine has a great poem about the rats, the city rats, the warning of the rats, and this is a critique. This is his point. He's raising the Aristotelian point about the problem that the urban poor in the urban areas are the rat who's hungry, wants more, the revolutionary rat. This is why what the depopulation of the rural areas and driving them into the cities of the peasantry to make the urban thing. This is done for the purposes of developing commerce and developing industry. Creates the urban poor, and the urban poor is an engine of revolution. Okay, they're vicious. They are the poor with envy. They're not. They have no access to means but their labor. And when the system is dead, the economy is shutting down. They have no means to survive but to take. The rural peasant can still survive. So therefore, you have the radical situation. The urban, even the small poor farmer is better off than the urban poor. This what moderates farmer democracy, and why the radical urban democracy is so vicious, particularly when law is removed. Okay, so let's continue. In other words, and most particularly superior to both in other parts, but if not superior, that they're connected. They do this. In other words, they can if they should be that the most numerous, but if not, they should be. If they merge with one or the other, either the many or in other words, they become the defining element. They become the ruling part by switching. They're kingmakers. In other words, if they will side with the people to prevent the rich from being that, and they will side with the rich to prevent the many from harming the rich. They will move they will switch sides to avoid the extremes of the negative extremes or the worst characteristics of the two parties, the rich and the poor, the very wealthy and the poor. Thus, it is the greatest good fortune for those engaged in politics to have a middling and sufficient property. Because uh, where some possess very many things and others nothing, either rule of the people in an extreme form must come into being, or an unmixed oligarchy, or, as a result of both of these excesses, tyranny. If there is not if there's only this situation where we have some who have everything and many who have nothing, and very many things, some who have this and others nothing, either have rule of the people in extreme or an unmixed extreme oligarchy. both of these in excess, and then hence tyranny, the tyrannical form, the Gnostic oligarchy without law, or the last democracy, which is without law. Both are tyranny. For tyrannies arise from the most headstrong of sort of democracy and from oligarchy, but much less often from the middling sort of regime and those close to them. Hence the middle class hypothesis. Right? This is where Mister Seymour Lipset, Martin Seymour Lipset, gets his middle class hypothesis from, but he gets it wrong. He associates with the bourgeoisie, the urban middle class. No, that's not the answer. It's about having enough. It's about resources and the resources of enough and dealing with enough, making sure that the citizenry has enough. Not excess, but enough. Creation. It's the middle class here is not, it's the Archie Bunker is the middle class you want. Go watch Archie Bunker TV. He is not a college educated person. He's an urban middle class worker, but he's able to have a house. He's able to have a wife who doesn't work. He's able to send his child to university and pay for her boyfriend to go to university. Okay? He has enough that he doesn't have to rely on the government. Doesn't have to rely on charity. Has employment. The destruction of the working class. Once the middle class is no longer seen as that, but as the entrepreneurs and this. Okay, I mean, I understand. I was libertarian. I had the same thing. We like the opportunity. Entrepreneurs create jobs. Yes, that's true. But we forget that if the workers cannot have enough, that's the wisdom of Henry Ford. It wasn't the government who created the wage, who made cars affordable it was Henry Ford who increased the wage. Why? So he wanted to have his workers to be able to buy a car. He says once they can buy the car, that means everyone can. Capitalists have lost their understanding of what the purpose of it is. Yes, it's supposed to be, but cheap fellow citizens. Okay, but we can do that by hiring third world people. Okay, you can do that. Are you going to live with the people who you just impoverished? You're going to make them become welfare recipients and unemployed, not be able to afford a house. You're going to live with them. No, you don't live with them. You're great. You're going to live in your little paradise who never meets with anyone else. The wealthy become international people and globalists and like this, and they don't have to live with the other people. They don't live neither with the people that they decided to make poor and the people who they desire to improve. But the workers that they've done, and yes, they're doing. Let's not be lie. By their moving the jobs and wealthy, they get wealthy, and the poor third world get better. The conditions in the third world massively improve. The quality of life massively improves. But the quality of life of their fellow citizens who they were from dramatically decreases. Okay, the overall aggregate situation of wealthy the goods and services become cheaper so that even the poor can afford them, but the poor can't afford maybe things like houses anymore. Oh, but this is the Great Reset. They can be happy without that. No, they can't. Why? Because they become poor. They become without means. They become slavish, obedience. They become envy. They become resentful. They become revolutionary. They have nothing to lose. And they will turn to anyone who prompt. Okay, you're going to. Therefore, aren't you giving the anti-Trump argument? No. If any, I fear the next thing more than Trump. Trump was too nice of a guy. He was not ruthless. All you idiots who hated Trump, be careful. The thing you'll destroy him, and you'll produce something far, far worse. I make that same argument to my Polish friends who hate Kaczynski. They despise my academic colleagues. So despise, he's the greatest evil. My God, he's the thing that's keeping the greatest evil from happening. There are forces far more worse than him out there. And he's more moderate than the extremes. That's the point about this. It's not that you demonize the other side and what you get is worse, not better. Gresham's law. Oh, sorry. We will speak of the reason for this later in the discourses which are on revolutions and regimes. So he's going to warn us. This is 46. Appears to be in 5.8 and 5.7 about preservations and regimes. We're going to talk about why this happens. But the middling sort is the best evident, is best as evident. Now, politically, this is the case. The middling sort is the best as evident. It alone is without factional conflict. Very interesting argument. Where the middling is numerous, factional conflicts and splits over the regimes occur least of all. And large cities are freer of factional conflicts for the same reason. In other words, the larger city is a small city is going to have only rich and poor. It's going to be hard to have a large middle class. The larger city, you can have people with enough resource, a larger middle class. And that is why, by the way, federalism was argued for. Federalism and the idea of a large commercial republic in Madison was a very he was being very Aristotelian here. His argument he needed to, if we're going to be small cities, the problem with the small cities is you always have the problem of the rich and the poor. You can only by creating a larger political environment, and that you only can do this by a federated system. This is why the ancients don't create middle class regimes. The ancients never established middle class because their cities are too small, their polises are too small, their political form is too small, cannot grow big enough. Only by the creation of the federated system did Madison believe you could escape the conflict of the small republics. That's why there's two very good books by Colleen Sheehan on Madison that are her book about the thoughts of government chapter, where she points about how Aristotle through an early ancient medieval late a commentator on Greek cities, basically repeating what Aristotle said, that really shaped Madison's thinking here. Colin Sheehan's book on Madison is great, and to understand that, I think this is why his last two books on this would be useful to understand. This is where Madison is both kind of modern, but points to the classic. This is why you should understand not only that it's a conflict of interest, but also a conflict of groups. This deviate faction checking faction, right? This is one way, but also this idea of blending of the system, expanding it. So therefore, you escape this narrow conflict within the smaller cities. And larger cities are freer of factional conflict for the same reason, that the middling element is numerous. So therefore, that's the whole point. So that where the middling element is more numerous, factional conflict split regimes are less frequent. Where they're in larger cities are when they have this large middle class, they'll be free of factional conflict. When they're not, it's not going to happen. It's going to be the opposite. In small cities, it's easier for all to be separated into factions and not to have no one left in the middle. And nearly everyone is either poor or well off. Okay, right? And democracies are more stable than oligarchies. So again, this is interesting. That's bigger cities, smaller cities are either going to be all poor or all wealthy, extremes. Bigger cities, you have more possible. There'll be more possibility in the middle. Smaller cities will be less middle. Another thing about here is democracies are more stable than oligarchies and more durable on account of because of the middling sort, who are more numerous and have the greater part in the prerogatives in democracies than an oligarchy. So the middling sort will probably become predominant because they have the more access to prerogatives in democracy than an oligarchy. Sorry, this is what go here. When the poor predominate numerically, in the absence of these, the middling, they fare badly and are quickly ruined. So if there's a many with the poor are many, without no middle sort available to lead, they will become quickly ruined. It should be considered an indication of this that the best legislatures are from the middling sort. Solon was one of these. It is clear from his poems, and Lycurgus, for he was not king, Cardias, and most of the others. Now, this is interesting. In other words, for Solon, Athens, that Plutarch Solon, from Plutarch Solon 1 and 14, the view that Lycurgus was king in Sparta and therefore a wealthy man appears. For example, Plutarch, Lycurgus, and Solon 16. So therefore the question that they were wealthy. Now, Plutarch seems to suggest that he was king, but Aristotle suggests he was the middling sort. It is evident from these things why most regimes are either democratic or oligarchic. Again, this is because of what? Who the dominant one, either the wealthy or the poor. For as a result, the fact that the middling element, is often few in them. Whichever is preeminent, whether those owning property or the people, overstep the middle path, and conduct the regime to suit itself, so that either the rule of the people come into being or an oligarchy. So in other words, you have this two situation. You have if the wealthy, the things who possess all the property, and the people. These when they overstep a middle, there's no middle to kind of block them from going to extremes. This will be the ruling that, or that is going to be ruling that. In addition to this, on account of factional conflict and fights that arise between the people and the well-off, the multitude, people, the multitude, and the well-off, whichever of the two succeeds in dominating its opponents, do not establish a regime that is common or equal, but they grasp for preeminence in the regime and as a prize of victory. So in other words, you have the rich, the poor, and the wealthy and the poor, the multitude, the wealthy and multitude. And if they hate each other, they're going after each other, they're not going to create a regime that is equal, common or equal. It's going to say, I'm going to rule for my sake. Winning is a victory. I'm going to enjoy the prize. We're going to enjoy the prize. Therefore, you're not ruling for shared benefit. You're ruling for my side, my side, my side, my side, my side. That's going to only lead to the city is not one. There's no love of affection. There's going to be two sides who hate each other, and they treat the other as slaves. And that regime is the victory prize, he says here, right? And further, those who achieved leadership in Greece have in either case looked to their own regime in establishing either democracies and oligarchy in cities. This is 48, references the Spartans and Athenians, having in view not what is advantageous for the cities, but rather what is advantageous for themselves. Therefore, make the world safe for democracy. No. Here's a little lesson. Given people who are not ready for democracy, democracy does not produce democracy, it produces tyranny. Democracy that is unrestrained is tyrannical. People who are not, this is what he's saying here. Therefore, an idea that the Athenians and things didn't really look out for what is best for the cities. If you're going to give regimes to cities, you should be looking out for what is best for them, not as what is best for you. What is best for us may be, you're looking for, okay, yeah. In Sparta's case, they believe that giving everyone oligarchies would be is better for them. And Athens thought by overthrowing making everyone democratic. But this is interesting. Remember the Syracusans with democracy. When the Athenians invade Syracuse, they don't really want to give them a democracy. They are a democracy, and that will destroys that. This is when the war goes pear shaped for Athens, right? So, in other words, they for not having in view what is advantageous for the cities, but rather what is advantageous for them. So, for these reasons, the middling regime has either never arisen or have done so infrequently and in few cities. In other words, it's unlikely. It's gonna because of these situations, because the cities are small, not big enough to be it, and that these two cities, and because the wealth there's not enough of them, and also that the way cities have engaged, cities don't engage what is best for the people that they're looking for themselves. They're looking for themselves, so everyone is looking for themselves in self-interest. Okay, this is why the middle regimes don't come into being, and this is why stability doesn't happen because everyone is pursuing my interest and my group's interest at the expense of the collective good. For those who have previously held leadership, rule, dominant, one man alone has persuaded to provide this sort of arrangement. And the custom is now established that those in cities do not even want equality, but either seek to rule or endure being dominated. Now, 49, this references the identity of this individual has been disputed. Solon and Themendes are commonly cited as possibilities, but what seems wanted is a leader of a hegemonic state. The most probable candidate would appear to be Philip of Macedon, right? This is okay. The idea of a hegemonic state, and I think this is probably is the case. He's referring to Philip. In other words, those who held leadership, one man alone provided this sort of arrangement um, of a middling sort. In other words, this hegemon. And custom is now established that those in cities do not even want equality, but either seek to rule, to dominate, or to endure being dominated. And this is the end of politics. Politics is being ruled and ruled in turn. It is want to have an equality. Hegemony is not that. Hegemony, this is what leadership is, leadership rule. Hegemony is what? To be one man alone, to rule simply, and everyone else obeys. So therefore, the cities now behave that they're going to do what? Those who live in the cities do not want equality, they want domination, to rule, or endure domination. This is at the level of geopolitics, but it's also at the level of the city itself. How cities view other cities is how citizens view other citizens. What the best regime is, then, and for what reason is evident from these things. Is evidence from these things. What is the best regime? It is the balanced regime. It's the middling regime, the political regime. It is the regime of political activity, which is what? Of citizens. Isn't that the first democracy in Book 4, Chapter 4? That is dropped out? Isn't that really what the regime called regime really is a democratic regime of equals? Or this is what political rule is? The nature of political rule is that of equal citizens? That political rule, that's hence the regime, and not a hegemony, a mastery or a monarchy. This is why we get back to that first argument all the way in chapter 1, book 1, chapter 1. Those who argue that basileos, kingship, despotikos, master, politikos, and oikonomikos are the same thing are in error. They're not. They're not the same. The despotikes, mastery, the oikonomikos, which is head of household, or fatherly rule, kingly rule, which is fatherly rule, and politicos a different kind. And therefore, this leads us to the understanding of what's being here. Political rule, the regime of politeia, has a regime has is his political rule. To politos, the political and the regime are interconnected. And when the regime is healthy and that produces the stability, it is that one of equality. There's some levels of equality. Now, you can achieve this equality how? Either that they are similar, but if they're not, then what you have to do is you have to balance them. You have to mix, you have to blend. And because the city is composed of parts, not unity, you're not a homogeneous whole, but a composite of discrete groups. The larger it is, this allows the rise of the middle. This is why the middle is best. But the middle is not likely, he says, in this sense. And when the cities are small, that when people are going to treat winning as I get to do what I want for my own sake, and my group's sake at the expense of the others, victory is a prize. What is, again, this thing here? So let's continue here. As the other regimes, we have asserted that there are several sorts of democracies and several sorts of oligarchies. Once the best is defined, it is not difficult to see which is the best, which is to be best regarded as first, which is second, and so on in the manner according to which whether it is better or worse. Therefore, it's very interesting, he says. As we notice that there's several regimes in this, we can see each one regime, which one's better and which was worse, right? Better democracies and the worst democracies, the better oligarchies. We know we're able to see what is better for. So therefore, what is the first and what is the second? Regard which is first and which is second, and so on in a manner according to which whether it's better or worst. The one that is closest to this must of necessary always be better, and the one that is more removed from the middle worst, provided one is not judging with a view toward presupposition. In other words, what is the presupposition? The presupposition is the claim the regimes make. So I need to look at it not from the terms of the claim that the regime makes about what is just, but rather systemically in terms of what moderates, not towards the peak that they aim at, because what they aim at, the presupposition, may take them to an extreme that is actually disadvantageous to the whole and to the situation. I say with a view to the presupposition because while one sort of regime is more choice-worthy, there is nothing to prevent another regime from being more advantageous for certain cities. So that's the weird thing here, right? The question is, what is advantageous? This is the difference between what sort of regime is choice-worthy. That I would like this. I would like this regime to be. But what is it? This is what I think is here. But it doesn't prevent another regime from being more advantageous for other cities. In other words, what is advantageous to your city? What is best for your city or certain cities? It's not going to be one size fits all, because every city is going to be differently composed, the different parts with different needs and different wants. Yes, a middle sort is good, but if they don't have the capacity to that, then you have to look at what is best for them. Again, this is the metaphor from the beginning of the book 4 about the doctor knowing what is best, what knowing the doctor and the trainer, how they train bodies. You look at the case, you look at the individual and the case, and you look at what is best for them. What is best for this one may not be best for the other one. Now we have a general rule: what is best generally. We know this, but in this situation, this person may be ill, and that if you did what is best generally for them, may actually not that it won't make them better, it may make them worse. So therefore, you have to do something that is least harm, something that is not good, but something that will move them from harming them to bending them better. So you might have to make a choice for something that is not what you would choose, what would be good for you and yours, but rather what is best for them. This is why the idiots, and this is what's wrong with the Bush administration policy and a lot of the Obama policy about democracy. This is what's wrong with modern political science and democracy policy. Cheerleading everyone to give nice liberal modern democracy is not going to work. It's going to produce the opposite. It's not what's best. It's not one side. This idea that all humanity is the same. This is the lie of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. That's a self-evident half-truth. It's not a complete. This is an exaggeration. To say that all men are created equal is a lie, because it's partially true. All men are equal in that we all die. We're all human. The things that we are all equal in is not definitive in ruling. It is not the things we will fight over or die over. It's what differentiates us, is what makes us who we are. Our commonalities don't define who we are. Our differences do. It's our differences by which we learn. And it's our differences that makes us equal, that brings us together, ironically. Come on. Heterosexual love, human nature takes two things that are not the same, drives them together for the sake of improving things. Homogeneous systems die. Heterogeneous systems are able to progress. The nature of the Greek political system is going to be heterogeneous, but one that seeks balance. Homogeneity is automatic balance, but the problem with this is that it has no future. It won't last. It will, like this is inbred. What's wrong with inbred? Inbreds get dumber, unhealthier, they die out, right? Therefore, the homogeneous regime over a long time will simply cease to exist. It'll become weaker and weaker and weaker until it can't survive any longer. The heterogeneous regime is able to allow, as long as it's stable, as long as you moderate itself and avoid the extremes, it will perpetuate itself. So therefore, here we end it. This has been a long one. I know people are going to say, boy, this is really ridiculously long. I'm sorry. I hope we can do this. If you have any questions, please put it below. We're at the end of the chapter, next chapter 12. If you have any questions, please put them below. Ask any comments, criticisms like this. If you like it, share it, please, with a friend. Share it in social media. If you don't like it, say no. And say why, and I can learn, The other thing you can do is you can follow me on social media if you want to, things like that. If you want to, again, YouTube is charging more and more. They're going to be charging us to put videos on here because of the size of our channel. Because it says we'll shut down our email, can't post any more videos. If you want to help, subscribe, star, Patreon, maybe even send me money. I don't care. Another way you can help, if you don't want to do that, I understand. I'm not doing anything. You build it, I will do something for there. You're going to say, you're not going to subscribe. You don't have special benefits for us yet. No, because I don't. Build it, and I will do something. Okay, but here, another way you can help is buy the book. Buy my Lulu. Buy Lulu. You buy Lulu. Okay, Amazon is available, but if you go to Amazon, I don't get that much money. Lulu, yes, it's horrible because they charge you for shipping, but I get more. I get 3 times the amount of money that I would get from Amazon. No, 5 times the amount of money I get from Amazon. So I get right there. Um, Given the changes, the prices they did. Um, it's not a commentary, it's not interpretation, it is a workbook, notebook on Aristotle. It is like Cliff's Notes. It's not a mere summary, it's a study guide. It helps you go through it, it guides you through the text with charts, outlines, and things like this. That's that. Again, that's it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for bringing up this today. It's very long. See you next time when we got chapter 12. Um, have a good day. Bye.